You are listening to Book Clips, a podcast where authors and narrators expose you to excerpts from different books. You can find the show and more by searching for The Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher.
This is Adan Ramie reading from my book, Rescued. Chapter 4. Back at the shelter, Chuck swept inside Brenda's office with a whistle and a bounce in her step. Before she could put the flowers in a vase or present Brenda with the bear claw, her sister was already talking. "I refuse to be bought," Brenda said. They both knew she would do no such thing. Chuck tucked the flowers into the vase she found under the cabinet, added water, then placed it near enough to Brenda that she could smell them. Yeah, hand over the food." Chuck grinned and pulled out the box containing the sticky pastry. She had finished her own treat on the way over, but the aroma from her sister's bribe still made her stomach growl. She soldiered on. Brenda took a big, sticky bite, let out a groan to rival her sister's, and leaned back into the chair. "He must have only made these this morning," she said in an awestruck whisper. "The man's hands are touched by divinity." Chuck sat down against the corner of Brenda's desk and waited. With each bite, she knew she was getting closer to what she wanted, and she could barely suppress a grin. Brenda noticed and carefully placed the bear claw back into its box and closed it. "Good, right?" Chuck asked innocently. Brenda scowled. "Don't think you can buy me off with sweets and flowers like one of your girlfriends." Chuck pretended offense. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have never done such a thing." Brenda rolled her eyes, licked her fingers, and put the box with the half-eaten treat into her desk drawer. She closed it with a snap, then leveled her eyes on Chuck. "Are you sure this girl, what's her name?" "Stella," Chuck filled in. "Are you sure this Stella knows what she's doing? Because unless every woman who comes to this fundraiser is wet for tomboys with dog drool stains on their shirts, you're not going to be much help." She smirked and pushed back her chair. Chuck gawked at her, glanced at her shirt to see that, in fact, she did have dog drool stains on it already, then stifled a surprised laugh. "I've never heard you talk like that." "Like what?" Brenda leaned back as Chuck half stood and leaned over her desk. "I know you don't like to talk about moisture." Brenda gagged and shook her head. "You know I don't like that word." "What? Moist?" Chuck laughed and sat back down. She pulled her phone from her pocket, opened the gallery, and flipped it around so Brenda could see pictures of Stanley she'd already taken. "Who could say no to this face?" Brenda half-heartedly raised a hand. "It's going to be a hard road for him. Are you sure you want to put him through that?" Chuck set her jaw. "He deserves some happiness." "He deserves to be put out of his misery," Brenda responded. Chuck stood up, tucked her phone away, and looked down at her sister through wavy bangs that fell nearly over her eyes. "You don't have to understand, Bren. You just have to be willing to let me try. You're going to have to get the okay from Kenna. I might have the skills, but she still holds the purse strings, and she didn't sound sold when I asked her this morning." Brenda sighed, then raised her hands in defeat. "Fine, you're right. I don't get it. But I know you mean well, and I know you'll spoil the heck out of him. If you can get Kenna to sign off on it, I'll check him over this afternoon, and if it looks like the antibiotics are helping, I'll start prepping him for surgery." Chuck skipped around the desk and flung herself into Brenda's arms for a tight hug. When she pulled back, Brenda's face was red and halfway between a snarl and a smile. Chuck smiled back. "Thanks. I know you had a heart in there." Brenda rolled her eyes. "Ugh, fine. Get out so I can get some work done." With Brenda's blessing, Chuck felt like she could finally breathe again for the first time since she laid eyes on the pitiful Yorkie. She had felt the same way before many times. 9 times out of 10, she and Brenda worked together to save the animal. Once in a while, though, the poor thing died, and Brenda's words would haunt her, sounding just like her father when his advice had come true. "Should have put her out of her misery when I said. Can't play God with him, Chucky. I knew we should have quit while we were ahead." Chuck tossed her hair out of her eyes, walked out a side door, and grabbed a shovel. With over 40 dogs and other rooting, bleeding, and squawking animals of all shapes and sizes, there was a lot of mess to clean, but Chuck didn't mind it as much as most people might. she found cleaning up after them relaxing. Shovel in hand and earbuds pressed into her ears, she could feel free to let her mind wander wherever it wanted to go, and today it flitted straight from Stanley to Stella. What a beauty. Her hair was a dark, shiny halo that was almost too beautiful to be believed. The way she scrunched her nose when she thought something was funny made her look like a little rabbit, and reminded Chuck of her first pet, Midnight. And that body. Chuck closed her eyes and leaned on her shovel, ignoring the sniffing and nudging of animals at her heels. Stella's body curved in all the right places. She was well made, not frail, but feminine in ways that her soft butch clothes could never hide. A wet nose nudged her arm, and Chuck opened her eyes to a Great Dane ready to hop up to look in her eyes. She rubbed his head and pressed slightly down so he knew she wasn't in the mood for a face-to-face. "How's it going today, King?" she asked and scratched behind his ears. He wagged his tail and let out a rumble of excitement from his barreled chest. Chuck propped the shovel up against a nearby tree, then bent down to give the big dog a bear hug. He nuzzled his face into her neck and gave her skin a wet kiss. "You're a good boy." She stood and surveyed the scene around her. The plot of land they were on wasn't much. It definitely wasn't all she wished they had, but it helped many of the animals in their care get regular exercise, which made it easier to care for them and adopt them out when their time came. "I wish I could bring you home with me, too," she told the dog, "but you are way too big. The landlord would never let me keep you, and that would put me and a whole bunch of other furry guys out of a home. And you wouldn't want that, would you, boy?" The dog panted at her happily, licked her hand, and gave a low bark. She scratched behind both of his ears, then let her short fingernails run down both his sides, and ended with a pat on his wagging tail. "Go have some fun with the others. I have work to do." She nodded her head, and he took off, running toward a mutt who loved to play tag. Chuck laughed, grabbed her shovel, and went back to work. Immediately, her mind was back on Stella, but it wasn't on her body or her face. She wondered about what Brenda said. Was Stella just blowing smoke, or was she actually skilled in fundraising? Would they be able to raise enough to save Stanley's life? And if they did Stella really want to co-parent him with her? So many thoughts crowded her head, she didn't stop shoveling until she had all the waste pushed through. So many thoughts crowded her head, she didn't stop shoveling until she had all the waste pushed off into a trough. So many thoughts crowded her head, she didn't stop shoveling until she had all the waste pushed off into a trough. Glancing behind her, she realized she had done more than she came to do, then shrugged it off. A little hard work never hurt anyone. She opened a large barrel and scooped off several mounds of sawdust, coated the top of the waste with it, closed the barrel, and put away the shovel. This, at least, was done. All she had left to do was talk to Kenna. It couldn't be too hard. Once upon a time, she and Kenna had meant something to each other, and despite the way they ended, and the awkwardness between them now, she could play on a leftover heartstring to save the little Yorkie. Surely. Sweaty and tired, she rubbed the back of an arm across her forehead, then walked to the door that would lead back into the shelter. She shed her gloves and shoes at the door, then stepped inside in socks to go wash her hands. On the way, she passed a woman about her age being led to look at the puppies and nodded hello to the young staff member with her. The boy nodded back and went back to his spiel. Anyone who worked at the shelter had to be well trained, because one of the things Brenda and Chuck had in common was that as much as they loved the animals, they didn't want to see any of them come back. Or worse, end up in another shelter, due to owner remorse or maltreatment. Kenna encouraged it, because with every animal that left the shelter with a capable owner, their coffers were left fuller than before. None of them would ever be rich, but neither would they go hungry. Chuck made it to the bathroom, washed up, and stared at herself in the mirror. Her face was red from exertion, but she felt good, and she smiled at her reflection. The sense of self-confidence was relatively new, and she still relished the knowledge that she actually liked herself every time she felt it. "Don't fall in, Narcissus." The voice from behind her brought a frown to her face. As much as she wished they could get rid of the woman invading her personal space, Brenda and Chuck both knew Kenna was a large part of the team. In fact, her early contribution had earned her over half of the company. Chuck consoled herself with the fact that her ex-girlfriend rarely came out of her office. Hello, Kenna, Chuck said, her voice cool but calm. How are you today? Well enough, Kenna replied, and started washing her hands. Chuck hated watching, but she did it with a kind of morbid fascination. At first, she thought Kenna's methodical, intense scrubbing was a nice change from some of the hygienically challenged women she had dated before, but after a while it got a little weird, then more than a little annoying. Brought in another lost cause that's going to cost the shelter a few grand, I noticed. Chuck offered a tight-lipped smile as she dried her hands and tried to avoid Kenna's eyes. I'm going to raise the money to foot the bill through a fundraiser if that's okay with you. Kenna chuckled, but nodded. Chuck's blood started to heat, but she kept herself in check. Have a good day, Chuck said, and walked toward the door. Kenna turned off the faucet with her elbow, then maneuvered the hand dryer on with her shoulder. Good luck with your fundraiser. I hope you're selling more than just your cookies. This is Adan Ramie, and you've been listening to Rescued.
This was an episode of Book Clips. Check out the show notes for more on this book. And it would be great if you would rate the show and subscribe to the Lesbian Talk Show podcast channel for more woman-centered content. If you are an author of lesbian fiction, then send us your reading. You can find out how on the lesbiantalkshow.com/reading.